Hello and welcome to Fire Headlines, where we cover the hottest topics in fire service news. I'm your host, Samantha Didion, and joining me on the panel today is Chief Bob Horton. We do have a little bit of a shakeup on the show with Chief Jeff Buchanan, but Bob, I'll let you share some of that information with our listeners.
Well, thanks, Samantha. It's good to be back. It's a little lonely on the panel today. Of course, it's conference season. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So a lot of folks are busy in travel and talking about important issues, a lot that pertains to the fire department. But our good friend and colleague, Chief Buchanan, has taken a new position. And so he's going to be leaving the show, and we can't yet quite talk about what it is that he's going to be doing, but we'll be excited to invite him back, have him join us, share what he's been doing, and provide some insight in this new area that he's going to be spending his time working. But we're really grateful for what Chief Buchanan has brought, his insight and analysis and discussions, and certainly his energy that he's brought to our show and these issues that we have talked about, and really wish him the best of luck as he moves forward into this new professional venture.
Absolutely. And Bob, like you just mentioned, it's been a pretty busy conference schedule, including the Wildland Urban Interface Conference that you were at a few weeks ago. Can you tell us what some of your key takeaways from that conference were, as well as some other conferences you've been at?
Yeah, sure, Samantha. You're right. A couple of weeks ago, a lot of us converged in Reno, Nevada for the Wildland Urban Interface Conference. It's hosted by the IAFC. And then this week, I'm in Boise, Idaho for the International Association of Wildland Fire Conference. And this is an international conference that is streaming, not just streaming, but there's 3 different locations, international locations, I believe in Ireland and Australia, as well as in Boise, Idaho, where the conference is going on this week at the same time, with sessions that are streaming across these nations. It's quite an undertaking from an administrative standpoint, but very interesting to have conversations that are going on in an international scale around wildland fire. But a common theme that's coming up at a lot of these conferences are certainly future focused. How are we going to, as a fire service, as a fire industry, address wildfire challenges? And that's both from a response and suppression perspective and a workforce perspective, but also community mitigation and risk reduction. Wildfire is complex, as we've talked about on this show, oftentimes, and is to take many efforts in a multifaceted approach to try to make an impact and help preserve communities and the landscape and environment. It's going to take all hands and a lot of work, and it's exciting to see what is being talked about at these conferences. A common theme is technological advancement, remote sensing, detecting fires and intensity of fires sooner. There's some great projects we have the fortunate to be part of through our Applied Sciences Center of the Western Fire Chiefs and some of our other work that we're familiar with, but many that we're not familiar with. And the willingness to pull together all of these players who in some spaces are from a business perspective competitors, but come to the room together to say, we're really here about solving a problem, and how do we share information in a meaningful way? So if you're not paying attention to what is advancing in terms of technology, I encourage our listeners to do so, to look at what's being invested in, look at where the satellites, for example. There's a FireSat project that I won't do it justice trying to explain it because it's technologically well over my head, but has to do with low orbiting satellites and their ability to detect at a very granular level that today we don't necessarily have the ability to do, that can monitor and forecast fire behavior, that'll help inform decision environments for incident commanders, but everybody who has some role in protecting communities from wildfire. Essentially will have better information, and we're not talking about decades away, but we're talking about years. And in some cases, we'll see advancements this fire season.
Bob, what has been like the most, maybe the strangest new advancement that they've shown at some of these conferences?
I don't know that I would describe it as strange, but I would describe this as the role that artificial intelligence can play to as a tool that becomes a resource. I've been in the fire service for just under 2.5 decades. And we trained differently. We learned differently to what it is our firefighters that are being hired today are going to, the environment that they're going to perform under is going to be so much more technologically advanced. I mean, we were using intuition and hunches and leaning on those with decades before us experience to help inform decisions. But talking to firefighters, even those with that experience today on the ground, particularly as it relates to wildland fire, is the environment is different. These fires behave unlike any that they've seen in the past. So relying on experience and intuition alone is going to be an unsuccessful recipe, both for managing these disasters, but also keeping firefighters safe. We have better intelligence, information processed to become useful for decision making than we've ever had in the past. So it's foreign to me, how artificial intelligence can be useful. I'm convinced, I'm fully persuaded it's the right movement in the right direction. And I'm also persuaded at, having been at these conferences, that we have some of the smartest and brightest minds working on these challenges. What we get to do, through the Western Fire Chief, some of the work we do and the Applied Sciences Center is connecting those bright minds who are building these models and tools and connecting them with the practitioners in the field, familiarizing them with not only what technology is available today, but what is coming down into the future in the next years, because we have to prepare our workforce for how to use these tools in a meaningful way. So I find the most intriguing, yet also the most overwhelming. That's how I'll define strange for the question you asked me, Samantha, is how artificial intelligence is going to change our environment. Our practitioners, we get afraid of what change could look like because it introduces uncertainty. And most of us as humans don't like uncertainty. But I wouldn't be afraid of how this is going to make the environment that we can make decisions in much better. We can be more efficient, more importantly, more safe.
But we've been seeing a lot of articles in the Daily Dispatch, one that we'll talk about today. But the general theme we're seeing is property and different kinds of insurance. So I'm wondering, what are the conversations that are happening at these conferences regarding this theme, and how big of a problem is it?
Samantha, I'm glad you bring that up, because you can't turn a corner right now in a wildfire conversation and not be talking about the insurance challenges, the insurance crisis. I would go as far as a level of saying this is a major problem, and everyone should be paying attention to this. Whether you're in the fire service in an area that is described, and I'll use air quotes, as a wildfire prone region, you will be impacted by the effects that this has had on the insurance industry significantly. And so the answer to your question is at every level of what's being discussed in the conferences somehow applies back to this challenge of availability and affordability of insurance, because insurance represents a market against uncertainty based in an element of risk. So I like to substitute, when we have a conversation about insurance, is a conversation about risk, because the insurance industry's role sort of in society is to help protect us, people, families, against unexpected financial costs or impacts resulting in a risk to loss to your assets. That's just sort of a fundamental role that we have insurance for. We have health insurance. We have sometimes we have life insurance. If you own a house and have a mortgage, you likely have mortgage insurance, and your car is insured against damage. And then on our homes, we have property and casualty insurance as well. And those are ways to edge against a potential loss, a significant catastrophic loss. The fire service and the insurance industry have something largely in common. We are both mutually interested in lowering risk to the community. So the insurance folks would, their job is to price that risk in a way that, of course, it's a for-profit model. It's a business model provided by private industry. And so they're trying to make some money in terms of this business exchange that we have, and lower their risk of having to pay out against a claim. It doesn't bother me, right? It doesn't bother me that they make money, that I pay into this system so that I have some assurance against having a significant financial loss. So the reason I start to frame it that way, Samantha, is that really we need to talk about risk. So at these conferences, there's a lot of conversation about how do we understand risk how is risk modeled in a way that's meaningful for insurance companies to understand and price the risk in a way that creates market equilibrium, that there is insurance, that it's available, that it's affordable to the people who need it, and that it is appropriately priced against the risk. And what we've learned in the last, I'd say half a decade, maybe longer, maybe let's call it a decade, in our wildfire experience at large across the United States, is the models that the catastrophic modeling industry has been using. There's a lot of complexity here. It's kind of a complicated thing, but it's important that we talk about it and that our listeners who are in the fire service particularly have an interest in understanding what it is that's going on beyond just they may have their own house that needs to be protected. But as a fire service leader, what role do you have in understanding this to your community? So the catastrophic modeling industry provides a risk model to insurance companies, that helps them understand what the risk is like. They've been doing this for ages and eons, that there's success in this modeling against risk to hurricanes, for example, as a different peril of disaster, because it's a bit more predictable in terms of its forecasting and what the effect would be. But those that listen to our show who live in hurricane-prone regions by no means are sobbing a river for those of us in wildfire areas who are starting to see our insurance rates rise up. I mean, they've been paying out the nose for insurance against hurricanes, tornadoes, that sort of thing for a long time, because the risk is more appropriately priced. One would argue. There's probably good counter arguments against that as well. So the modeling informs the risk. Insurers, then the risk insurance companies themselves have insurance against large risk. So there's insurance for the insurance, and that's called reinsurance. The availability to underwrite your risk with a reinsurance is part of the model so that these insurance companies can protect against their large losses. And this is a system that largely works until there's huge payouts by wildfire that has been poorly modeled. And it's nothing against the modeling industry. I don't want it to come out that way. The catastrophic modeling industry, not the models that are on magazine covers, those that are look at catastrophes and try to model them at scale, is the availability of information has been a bit scarce and is becoming better. And there's some great work that's being done that examines fire spread differently than what we have understood. There's been a lot of assumptions that go into these models. Assumptions go into models all the time that have been incorrect. And so trying to get past some of those incorrect assumptions are to what is correct is what is being talked about. That was a long way. That was a very long answer, Samantha, to get to what's being talked about in these conferences. And at the WUI conference, a great presentation by Dr. Mahmoud at a Colorado State University who's working on a project. Dave Winokur was there presenting on this project. And this is about an improvement in our understanding in vegetation to vegetation fire spread, vegetation to structure fire spread, and structure to structure fire spread. How do we disrupt as a fire service those pathways? These are entry points into the community from a wildland fire that spreads to a community. And so we have better information now that can inform those models that if we take risk reduction mitigation measures at scale in a community, it'll reduce that risk to the community. And the downstream effect of that is that the insurance industry would recognize that understanding of risk reduction and price that risk reduction accordingly. From a policy perspective, this regulatory posture against the insurance industry to say, well, you must make insurance available and you must make it affordable. I understand the arguments on that, but to me, I don't agree with that approach, because that isn't reducing the risk. And we have to focus in on lowering the risk and let the market will resolve itself. I do believe that if we lower the risk to the community. And that's where our energy and attention needs to be as a fire service. And these conversations at the conferences are around how do we lower this? How do we lower the risk to wildfire in generally and at scale? Parcel to parcel good, and we can talk about that too, but we really need to start to see it at scale. And the energy behind these conversations and the amount of brain power that's going into this is truly remarkable. And we should be proud as an industry to have such great people working on these problems.
Bob, I'm really curious to get your take on the article I mentioned. This article unfolds California's wildfire insurance crisis, mentioning that even the state's own firehouse can't get coverage. You took a look at this article. Can you kind of give me some of your thoughts on this situation specifically?
Yeah, it's humorous because there's irony. Like it's the reason that it garnered a lot of attention. Number one, it's California, which is garners a lot of attention in articles. Anyhow, I think this one we're looking at was written by Politico. And the irony in it is that the Cal Fire station cannot get its own insurance. And it's just really elevating to this sort of conversation at large about if a fire station with firefighters in it can't get insurance, what are the rest of us to do? Like that's the underlying theme of this article, and it's great conversation. And there's a few things worthy of discussing on this. Is it isn't enough to just have fire resources from a response perspective to inform the insurance making decisions. We've had Matt Hines Aldridge on our show before, and it'd be great to get his insight on this conversation as always, because he understands risk in ways that most of us don't always think about it. But we as the fire service leaders have turned a lot to the Insurance Service Organization, the ISO ratings, and what does that mean for our community? And there's still a lot of assumptions about how ISO might affect insurance rates. When this is dependent largely on where you live in the country, that there's different approaches that ISO is used. But out by where we're out west, ISO largely is not used as a resource for informing the insurance underwriting process. And what ISO used to do is it looks at your fire response. It looks at the equipment you have on your fire engines across your fire department, what's your availability of water supply systems and things like that. I assure you there are chiefs that are listening to this podcast right now that have some piece of equipment in their arsenal, in their fire department right now that has absolutely no purpose at all operationally, but for the fact that it's recognized by ISO as giving you points to your inputs. The one that comes to mind that was most laughable to me is the hose jacket. I'm in the fire service for 23, almost 24 years. I've never had a need nor seen the hose jacket used ever. But there it is in our inventory because ISO checks that off for points. I mean, it's just an archaic way of assuming that because a fire department has these things that we're going to have lowered risk. Now, sure, there's still insurance companies that look at rooftops of fire stations and determine your proximity to that rooftop and make an assumption that you have a good fire response. That's actually quite common. How close do you live to a fire station? You might hear that come out in from an insurance conversation. But some of the work Matt has been doing and always love to hear him talk about it is working with the insurance association that he does is they've developed a new risk and evaluation model that he's talked about on our show before. And that is really starting to look at what inputs are influencing outcomes, because the hose jacket isn't making a difference of whether your structure and or your community burns to the ground. But the things that they're looking at, and that's to inform the insurance industry on how do we marry what we understand from fire operations to risk underwriting. And that's the important conversation that needs to be had. So the article here is pointing out the irony in the fact that a fire station can't get insurance and what are we going to do about it. But it points to the same theme of what we've been talking about on this entire episode. And that's how are we going to work collaboratively to recognize risk reduction mitigations, to lower risk to communities, so insurance can, in fact, become available.
So, Bob, in light of the increasing frequency and intensity of wildfires, what role do you see for policymakers and insurance regulators in finding sustainable solutions to the insurance crisis?
We see value in there being a collaboration and alignment amongst fire service leaders, insurance leaders, and that's both insurance commissioners and insurance associations, and that they are sitting down having conversations and finding agreement or alignment on what mitigations do in fact matter to reducing risk across a community. and recognizing a pricing structure that recognizes that risk. So most importantly is, are we in the same rooms having conversations about risk in a meaningful way with this shared interest between fire service? And that's code enforcement officials. Maybe it's a state fire marshal, for example, an insurance commissioner, associations that represent the insurance industry, and those that represent the fire service and fire chiefs associations are sort of four key entities at a state level that has this conversation. Federal government does not regulate the insurance industry. Insurance is regulated state by state, and each state has a different set of regulations. So while this crisis is certainly at a national level, and that there's some evidence in the literature, in the academic literature, that speaks to, from a policy perspective, wildfire, when examined as a climate crisis, is seen by local and state entities as a federal government problem, when in fact the regulatory authority for many of solutions to risk reduction are at a state and a local level. And I'm speaking specifically to building codes. So how our structures are built impacts their risk. The propensity for that structure to be impacted by a fire, particularly a wildfire, can be influenced by how a building is constructed. If you think back to the children's fable of the Three Little Pigs and the Big Bad Wolf, right? And if you're the insurer and you're looking at, one structure was built with straw, one was built with sticks, and one was built with bricks. Which one are you wanting to write insurance for? And what is the cost of the insurance going to be for each of those as the Big Bad Wolf comes and tries to huff and puff and blow those houses down? And wildfire, while kind of a silly example, we have to look at it the same way. And how do we build structures that are going to be more susceptible to survive the effect of a wildfire? And that's going to be more enhanced building codes. Counter argument to that, the trade-off is it can cost more money. What that cost is, and whether it's negligible in terms of cost of construction or it's cost prohibitive when we're already living through a housing availability and a housing cost crisis, that's the value judgment and the debate that's happening politically. Scientifically, the International Business and Home Safety Research Team, IBHS, conclusively in my read of the evidence is that these building standards and having non-combustible materials and what I think is California is called Zone 0. It's a 0 to 5 feet from the structure. Defensible space it lowers your risk of your house being burnt to the ground. To me, it's a conclusive read of the science. What is the cost and what does that mean? That's the debate that occurs in our ideology about whether we should impose regulation or stricter building standards against a community building or not. And we don't have time probably to unpack all of that. Maybe we'll save that for another day on what then the downstream effects of that looks like in terms of who pays the overall bill. I know we've covered it in some of our other episodes as well. But that's the question is, where do we see this conversation happening? Where should policymakers be paying attention? Is what lowers risk? And will the insurance industry recognize a property owner like myself who does that work? I put in the effort, I do the work, I follow the standards, I have the defensible space. Is that going to affect my insurance underwriting? Because that's quite an incentive for me. Is like, I'm going to do this work because I want to lower the risk, but really I want to lower the cost of my insurance, which is a price that's put on the risk that I have. The insurance industry's perspective on that is it's great that you've lowered your property's risk, but you live in a high or extreme wildfire area of the county or the state. And unless your neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors and your neighbors' neighbors' neighbors also do the same risk reduction efforts, it may be negligible what I've done on my property. And that's a hard pill to swallow, because now you're looking at these risk reduction efforts at scale, neighborhood by neighborhood, community by community. And until we can lower risks across communities, because we're going to construct one today, Samantha, if you and I hit the lottery and we go out and buy hundreds and hundreds of acres of lands and we're going to develop communities, we would probably build them to the better knowledge that we have to protect against this and other climate issues that we foresee in the next 50, 100, 150 years to withstand all of that than they were built 50 years prior. but that doesn't do a lot for the homes and structures that are already in existence today. So that's why this is complicated. That's why this is hard. But the answer to that question is, where's our alignment between policymakers and insurers or insurance industry is recognizing risk reduction mitigations that matter, and getting the insurance industry or having the insurance industry recognize and understand how those risk reductions can lower risk overall and have it priced accordingly.
Thank you for your insights on that, Bob. Is there anything else that you'd like to share regarding your conferences or anything insurance related?
Oh, thanks, Samantha. I just want to overstate here the importance that it is that fire service leaders pay attention to what's happening in the insurance markets in your industry, in your community, whether that's you're in a wildfire prone region or you're not. When that homeowner that's a constituent in your jurisdiction loses their property insurance because due to fire risk, more than likely their next call is going to be to you, the fire service, to try to help inform them on what they can be doing to lower their risk. So it is important that fire service leaders are part of this conversation, that are understanding the impacts of this across your community. What is housing stock availability? The reach of the insurance challenges, Samantha, is so far into our financial institutions. That's why, I feel very comfortable saying we have a crisis and we need to take it seriously as communities. For those that are fortunate enough to be able to try to get a mortgage, to be able to get a mortgage to buy a house in today's housing environment, you are not going to get a mortgage from a bank without accessibility of insurance. The bank wants to insure their risk too, and make sure you have insurance for your risk, and so on and so forth. So if insurance is unaffordable, then housing ownership becomes unaffordable. Or if it's unavailable, then housing ownership becomes impossible. And these are economic drivers for individual wealth growth and community well-being and so on and so forth. So the take-home message is, I didn't know a lot about this as a fire chief. I've learned a lot more about it after in policy work that I've done, a little bit while being a fire chief. But I tell you what, this was not a topic. Land use planning and availability of insurance is not taught in leadership school on how to be a fire chief. And I would like to make the case that it should be. And so to our listeners on here, please take a dose, do some looking into your land use and the insurance and what's going on in that conversation in your state. Odds are the conversation is happening regardless of what state you live in.
Yeah, it sounds like a really complex conversation that doesn't seem like it's going away anytime soon. And hopefully it's something we can continue to pull apart on this podcast. But thank you so much, Chief, for joining us today. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in. A link to the article we discussed can be found in the show notes. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And if you have a question for the panel, please reach out to us at fireheadlines@wfca.com and let us know what's on your mind. We'll see you back here next week for more Fire Headlines.